In the shadow of history, some stories never made the headlines, yet they changed the course of wars. From weapons so advanced they were feared by the enemy, to acts of bravery lost in time. These are the tales that textbooks skipped. Today, we uncover the secrets, the machines, and the men whose stories the world almost forgot. This is the untold side of war. By the mid-19th century, the world's armies stood at the edge of transformation. For centuries, war had belonged to the horse, the saber, and the musket. But as the furnaces of Birmingham, St. Petersburg, and Pennsylvania glowed hotter, a new force took command: industry itself. It did not march or salute. It hissed, forged, and calculated. War was no longer a contest of men, but of machines. In 1854, the Crimean Peninsula became the first stage for this awakening. Ironclad vessels like HMS Warrior and the French La Gloire carved black silhouettes against a sea veiled with smoke. Their iron hulls defied cannon fire. Their engines drowned the wind. For the first time, navies fought not by wind and will, but by pressure and coal. Observers wrote of the clang of rivets echoing across dockyards, an industrial heartbeat that pulsed into the battlefield. The war's letters and dispatches traveled through the telegraph, shrinking distance and erasing hesitation. Orders once carried on horseback now arrived in minutes, turning commanders into operators of a global mechanism. Across the Atlantic, the American Civil War refined these grim innovations. Rails carried troops to their deaths faster than strategy could comprehend. The Union's ironclads, squat and ugly, patrolled rivers like floating fortresses. The telegraph lines crackled over miles of wilderness, transmitting the language of annihilation in bursts of electric code. Factories in the north became extensions of the battlefield, each smokestack a new artillery barrel, each press a coffin lid. The soldier's courage, once measured by his charge, was now smothered beneath the rhythm of production. Amid this mechanical evolution, the first experiments with automatic fire emerged. In a Berlin workshop, a Prussian engineer, his name later struck from official records, assembled what he called a repeating cannon. The device operated on a crude gas recoil principle, spitting projectiles at a pace that defied human endurance. Witnesses claimed the air vibrated as if the weapon were inhaling. Within months, the design vanished. Some said the prototype exploded. Others whispered that the government sealed it away, fearing what it foretold. Yet a century later, fragments of his blueprints would reappear in the archives of later wars. The handwriting faded, but the intent unmistakable. By 1865, the boundaries of warfare had shifted irrevocably. Breech-loading rifles, faster to reload and more accurate than muskets, rendered old tactics obsolete. Armies that once advanced shoulder to shoulder now sought trenches and cover. The air itself changed, acrid with gunpowder, saturated with smoke, and pierced by the metallic pulse of distant factories. Generals became logisticians, calculating not valor but supply ratios. War had become an equation of steel and distance. Reports from field hospitals told of new wounds, clean entry holes, shattered bones, burns from exploding shells. The surgeons called it industrial trauma. No one yet named it mechanized warfare, but its presence was unmistakable. Humanity had learned to kill with systems rather than with skill. The old codes of honor faltered before the discipline of machinery. As the century closed, nations armed not in preparation for glory, but in anticipation of efficiency. Rail lines webbed continents. Foundries thundered day and night. Politicians spoke of progress. Engineers whispered of potential. Yet beneath the hum of innovation, a darker realization took root. Each advancement narrowed the distance between invention and extinction. In the final archived entry of an anonymous war correspondent from 1867, one line is underlined twice in fading ink. When iron met fire, mankind realized it could outpace its own courage. The sentence remains preserved in the archives, a prophecy of what was to come. The Iron Dawn had broken, and from its glow would rise the shadows of future wars. Europe at the dawn of the 20th century stood immaculate and armed. Its capitals gleamed with electric light, its boulevards filled with uniforms cut in gold and steel gray. Behind every national anthem and parade lurked the pulse of engines and the whisper of calculation. The century had inherited iron from its predecessor, but now it sought velocity. Progress had become doctrine, invention, a form of devotion. By 1906, the Dreadnought, Britain's new battleship, had redefined the ocean's balance. With turbine engines and all big gun armament, she rendered every fleet before her obsolete overnight. Germany responded with haste, launching a naval program that consumed resources faster than Parliament could approve them. Shipyards along the Thames, the Elbe, and the Adriatic thundered day and night, their cranes moving like metronomes of approaching conflict. Admirals spoke in the language of tonnage and calibers, not peace or diplomacy. Each hull laid down was not merely a vessel, but a statement of intent. Across the skies, a quieter race unfolded. The Zeppelin, conceived in the still air above Lake Constance, lifted off like a prophecy. What began as curiosity soon found its purpose in reconnaissance and intimidation. Early airships, fragile yet majestic, carried the scent of oil and ambition. The press called them gentle giants. Military observers called them the future. In Berlin and Paris, engineers drew plans for armored gondolas and bomb racks. The air, once a sanctuary, was being conscripted. Inside laboratories, progress hummed in secret. Chemists experimented with nitrates and unstable compounds that could annihilate entire regiments in seconds. Metallurgists sought lighter alloys for faster guns and sturdier armor. The pursuit was not survival, it was prestige. Science had become patriotic art, an invention itself, an act of loyalty. Men who once painted landscapes now painted designs for artillery shells. Composers wrote marches in factories between demonstrations of weapon prototypes. Diplomats, seated in salons scented with tobacco and arrogance, spoke of stability. They toasted alliances whose clauses few fully understood, each signature tethering Europe to the next inevitable crisis. Treaties multiplied but went unread. The ink of one agreement often dried beside the blueprint of a new torpedo. Peace was not defended, it was designed out of relevance. In this climate of precision and denial, espionage became an academic discipline. Agents traded designs as if they were playing cards. A particular case survives in the archives of 1908, an intercepted letter from an engineer in Berlin to a colleague in Vienna. It referenced a sky cannon, a weapon intended to fire at altitudes where no enemy yet existed. Historians debate whether it was metaphor, mistranslation, or foresight. Some claim it described an early anti-aircraft prototype. Others believe it was something else entirely, a projection gun meant to disperse chemical agents into the clouds. The truth remains uncertain, but the letter's final line is recorded with chilling clarity. We must learn to strike the heavens before they belong to someone else. Factories expanded like fortresses. In Woolwich, workers assembled artillery at a rate that blurred the line between labor and mobilization. In Essen, Krupp's furnaces glowed brighter than cathedrals. Even neutral nations imported more rifles than they could ever use. The continent was tuning itself for a symphony of detonation. And yet, the streets were calm. Children played beneath posters of heroic soldiers and flying machines. The public believed in progress, unaware that every triumph of engineering carried a hidden fuse. The quiet years before 1914 were not years of peace, they were years of acceleration. From the vantage of history, one can trace the inevitability like a blueprint. Iron became engines, engines became weapons, and weapons became destiny. The war that would engulf the world had not yet been declared, but it had already been constructed, in laboratories, in shipyards, and in the fevered minds of men who mistook invention for immortality. No one knew the next war had already begun, inside the laboratories. In the summer of 1914, the spark that had been waiting in Europe's armories finally found its fuse. The assassination in Sarajevo was not the cause, merely the excuse. What followed was not a war in the traditional sense, it was a detonation. Alliances snapped into place like cogs meshing in a machine long prepared to move. The armies of the industrial age began to march, and the earth itself seemed to recoil. Within months, the old world collapsed into trenches. What had begun as mobilization became mechanization. Along the Western Front, the ground turned metallic. Barbed wire spread like an infection. The air filled with the constant grind of engines, the rattle of machine guns, the shriek of artillery shells that tore through soil and sky alike. Each battlefield became a production line of death, raw material, flesh, product, silence. At Ypres, the first poison gas was released. Witnesses described a yellow-green wall rolling low across the earth, slow and deliberate, as if it had consciousness. Men suffocated where they stood, their lungs dissolving before their rifles fell. Commanders noted its effectiveness in reports stripped of emotion. Laboratories responded with improved mixtures, chlorine, phosgene, mustard, each more efficient than the last. The language of progress persisted even as civilization choked on its own vocabulary. The machine gun, once a curiosity, became the war's metronome. It did not tire, feel fear, or wait for orders. It simply consumed. Generals calculated fire rates as they once measured cavalry speed. Every attack became a test of endurance against mathematics. In the mud between trenches, humanity learned the arithmetic of annihilation. 1 minute of fire equaled a battalion erased. The ground itself rebelled. Artillery shells fell with such frequency that fields were rearranged daily. Villages disappeared, their names surviving only as map coordinates. Soldiers lived beneath the surface like insects, surrounded by the odor of decay and burnt metal. Above them, the sky flickered with reconnaissance planes, fragile biplanes that observed the carnage like detached witnesses. They reported not victories, but percentages of destruction. In 1916, something new crawled from the mud. British troops near the Somme reported hearing metal thunder before seeing it, slow-moving shapes rolling forward through the smoke. The first tanks. Their armor groaned as they crossed the wire, engines growling like prehistoric beasts. For a moment, men believed these machines would end the stalemate. But within weeks, they too were bogged down, swallowed by the same earth they sought to conquer. The war absorbed them, as it had absorbed everything else. Among captured German documents recovered near Verdun, historians later found a memo written months before the tank's first appearance. It referred to ground vehicles, armored and armed, and to counter-engines already in testing. Whether this was foresight or coincidence remains debated, but its existence suggests a grim truth. The weapons of the next war were always being prepared before the current one ended. By 1917, the front was no longer a line. It was an ecosystem. Trenches filled, drained, and filled again with the dead. The rhythm of bombardment replaced the rhythm of breath. Factories in distant cities fed the front without pause, transforming iron, coal, and labor into shells that erased entire generations. War no longer required human passion. It sustained itself through logistics. In a soldier's diary found near Passchendaele, the final entry reads, "We wait for silence, but when it comes, it means they are reloading." That single line encapsulated the century's inheritance, the fear not of death, but of the pause before it. By the time the guns finally fell quiet in 1918, Europe had not been defeated. It had been processed. The machine had learned to function without its makers. From that point forward, war would require no ideology, no hatred, not even command. It would continue because it could. The world learned to fear silence, because it meant the guns were reloading. The Great War was not content with consuming the earth. By 1915, it had begun to claim the sky. What had once been a realm of clouds and silence became a laboratory of fragile machines, biplanes of wood, wire, and doped canvas, powered by engines barely strong enough to lift their weight. They rose from makeshift fields at dawn, shuddering in the cold air, carrying not soldiers but experiments. Humanity's reach had expanded upward, and war followed without hesitation. At first, flight served a single purpose: observation. Pilots carried cameras, not guns. They mapped trenches, counted artillery, and charted destruction with the detachment of cartographers. Yet the act of watching soon demanded control. When opposing aircraft met above the lines, they circled each other like predators testing the limits of gravity. Pistols were fired, then rifles, then machine guns were fixed to wings, synchronized with propellers so that death could be delivered through precision rather than chance. Thus, the dogfight was born. The first air-to-air kills were as unplanned as the war itself. Collisions, mid-air duels fought with desperation more than skill. But by 1916, the sky had structure. Squadrons formed, painted their insignias, and became both warriors and propaganda. Names like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, entered history not as men but as emblems. He flew his Crimson Fokker Doctor, I triplane through the mist of dawn, its color a challenge and a signature. Pilots on both sides spoke his name with reverence and superstition. The air war, unlike the trenches, allowed individuality, a fleeting illusion of heroism amid machinery. Yet for every legend, there were reports that refused to fit the narrative. Among the recovered flight logs from 1917, several describe encounters with an aircraft of unknown pattern, seen above the Ypres sector. Witnesses reported it moved without visible propellers and emitted no sound, only a faint hum, like distant wind through metal. Some dismissed it as atmospheric distortion or collective fatigue. Others, including intelligence officers, ordered the reports redacted. Months later, wreckage was recovered after a storm near the Ardennes. The fragments were unlike any known construction, metal alloy lighter than aluminum, seamless, and unmarked. It was catalogued under experimental, unverified origin and sealed within the archives of the German War Ministry. The documents bear one consistent annotation, not to be disclosed, beyond current capability. While official records of this incident remain inconclusive, the timing is notable. In 1917, both sides had begun to pursue aerial supremacy through innovation. Faster rotary engines, synchronized twin guns, early bomb sights, and night interceptors. The war above the trenches had evolved from reconnaissance to industrialized precision. The air, once pure, was now divided into zones of fire. Observation balloons became static targets, artillery spotters transformed into bombers, and every pilot became both scout and executioner. By 1918, the sky no longer belonged to nature. It was sectioned, patrolled, and weaponized. Pilots described a peculiar detachment when shooting down an enemy, watching smoke trail from a falling fuselage, seeing the crash bloom silently far below. One British ace wrote, "It feels as if the machine kills, not I." The sentiment appeared repeatedly in post-war testimonies. The human hand guided the trigger, but the rhythm of flight, the vibration, the recoil, the precision, belonged to the mechanism. In the aftermath of the armistice, as the airfields emptied and the survivors returned to Earth, investigators began to compile flight reports for archival preservation. Among them, the files regarding the unidentified aircraft were quietly transferred to Berlin's Technical Bureau. A single notation from an officer, dated December 1918, reads, "When the war ended, the files on that aircraft were sealed, not destroyed." It is uncertain whether the machine was real, imagined, or simply premature. Yet its legend persists as the first sign that in war's pursuit of dominance, invention had begun to escape human intent. The sky had ceased to be an element. It had become an extension of industry, haunted not by spirits, but by designs too advanced for their creators. The line between man and machine had begun to blur, and above the trenches, the first ghosts took flight. The guns had fallen silent in 1919, yet Europe remained a continent of smoldering ruins and cautious treaties. The Treaty of Versailles promised peace, yet beneath the formalities lay a continent quietly plotting its next confrontation. Cities rebuilt their facades, yet the skeletons of industry, factories, forges, and arsenals remained dormant but prepared. The interwar years were a decade of illusion, a period when governments painted compliance while clandestinely nurturing destruction. Germany, burdened by reparations and demilitarization clauses, became a master of secrecy. Officially, its army was restricted to 100,000 men, with strict limitations on artillery, tanks, and aircraft. Yet engineers and former officers found hidden avenues. Workshops disguised as civilian factories produced advanced prototypes. Test ranges were relocated to remote forests and mountains. Blueprints were circulated under code names, each a puzzle for the uninformed. Collaboration with the Soviet Union, itself eager to develop weapons far from Western scrutiny, allowed experimentation that would have been illegal under international law. Together, German and Soviet engineers tested armored vehicles, experimental artillery, and even early aircraft cannon designs, laying foundations that would later define modern mechanized warfare. Across Europe, similar shadows moved. In Sweden, scientists tinkered with rocketry and aerial reconnaissance designs, projects too provocative to be funded openly. France and Britain focused on defense treaties, building fortifications and strategic reserves. Yet many of their most promising innovations were buried in vaults or compartmentalized within secret departments. Nations pretended compliance, but the machines of war never rested. They merely hibernated. Amid this clandestine activity, a single journalist in Berlin, investigating the collapse of wartime industries, stumbled upon a discovery that would later seem prophetic. Beneath a defunct brewery on the city's outskirts, he found a hidden tunnel network, concrete-lined and filled with crates marked with cryptic alphanumeric codes. Among rusted tools and electrical coils lay blueprints labeled MK Series. The designs depicted compact artillery, high-velocity cannon prototypes, and mechanisms that resembled automated firing systems. No government acknowledged their existence, yet their meticulous detailing betrayed months, perhaps years, of development. This was not isolated. Across Europe, engineers labored behind closed doors, refining machinery, testing metallurgy, and simulating battlefield conditions in secret laboratories. Letters were exchanged under cipher, photographs smuggled between borders, and intellectual property quietly patented under the guise of civilian applications. The world observed treaties and agreements, yet underneath, the industrial appetite of war flourished, indifferent to diplomacy. Economies, too, bore the duality of reconstruction and preparation. Factories producing tractors, railcars, and steel girders were designed to convert seamlessly into arms production if required. Chemical plants capable of producing fertilizers doubled as precursors for munitions. Every infrastructure rebuild was both a sign of recovery and a hidden ledger of potential devastation. The architects of peace unknowingly facilitated the architecture of war. By the early 1930s, the global population experienced a fragile normalcy. Streets bustled, theaters opened, and governments convened international conferences. Yet for those with access to archives, the hum of hidden engines and the faint glow of laboratory lamps betrayed a far darker reality. Every suppressed memo, every coded correspondence, every underground facility whispered a single truth: the silence was temporary. The journalist's final note, never published, summarized the decade with an almost clinical precision. Peace was only an intermission. The machines were already humming again. Europe slept on the surface, but below, the gears of war turned tirelessly, ready to awaken at the command of ambition, innovation, and the inexorable drive of nations to outpace each other in destruction. Silence did not signify peace. It marked the incubation of inevitability. By September 1939, the world had returned to the grim calculus of war, yet the equations had changed. The lessons of the Great War had been absorbed, analyzed, and accelerated. Nations no longer marched to battle in stately formations. They moved with mechanized precision, coordinated by radios, punctuated by engines, and executed with a tempo that left traditional defenses obsolete. The Blitzkrieg was no mere tactic. It was war redesigned as a machine. Poland's plains witnessed the first full expression of this mechanized doctrine. Panzers tore through roads, railways, and villages, their steel tracks crushing barriers while radio signals ensured unit cohesion across dozens of kilometers. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Stuka dive bombers executed air support with ruthless synchronization. The German forces overwhelmed static defenses before infantry could respond, leaving a trail of obliterated bunkers and abandoned towns. Where World War I had ground men into mud, World War II ground them beneath wheels, treads, and propellers. Behind the scenes, engineers and scientists worked with equally exacting efficiency. In Reutlingen, an experimental facility produced a prototype cannon, the negative 103 Malawian Quaches. Its blueprints were carefully compartmentalized, every technician aware of only a fraction of the design. The negative 103 Malawian Quaches represented a shift in aerial gunnery, a high-velocity cannon capable of piercing the most reinforced aircraft and tanks, a weapon designed to exploit speed, accuracy, and lethality. Yet when test footage of its initial firing was reviewed, it vanished from the archives without explanation. Only a single blurred photograph remained, annotated, for internal review only. Across Europe, the transformation of warfare was unmistakable. Radios coordinated movements that would have required months of planning in the previous conflict. Infantry were no longer the fulcrum of campaigns. They were supplementary to steel and firepower. Behind the scenes, engineers and scientists worked with equally exacting efficiency. In Reutlingen, an experimental facility produced a prototype cannon, the negative 103 Malawian kwaches. Its blueprints were carefully compartmentalized, every technician aware of only a fraction of the design. The negative 103 Malawian kwaches represented a shift in aerial gunnery, a high-velocity cannon capable of piercing the most reinforced aircraft and tanks, a weapon designed to exploit speed, accuracy, and lethality. Yet when test footage of its initial firing was reviewed, it vanished from the archives without explanation. Only a single blurred photograph remained, annotated, for internal review only. Across Europe, the transformation of warfare was unmistakable. Radios coordinated movements that would have required months of planning in the previous conflict. Infantry were no longer the fulcrum of campaigns. They were supplementary to steel and firepower. Airplanes scoured the skies, tanks dominated plains, and artillery struck with relentless timing. The battlefield became a grid of mechanical advantage. Human agency diminished under the weight of engineered inevitability. Britain, aware yet unprepared for the mechanized onslaught, relied on innovations of its own. Chain-home radar arrays offered a new type of vision, eyes unseen, capable of detecting formations beyond the horizon, a silent guardian against a foe whose speed threatened to render conventional spotting obsolete. Radar operators, often young and inexperienced, became the interface between human decision-making and mechanized reality, guiding fighters toward the incoming storm. The sky was no longer an expanse of freedom. It was a vector of calculated destruction. The campaigns in France, Belgium, and the Low Countries further demonstrated the lethal efficiency of synchronization. German forces bypassed static defenses through mobility, combining air power and armor in a rhythm so precise it appeared almost preordained. Resistance, no matter how fierce, was a matter of time. Human improvisation faltered against predetermined trajectories of steel and fire. Amid the chaos, the negative 103 Malawian kwaches continued to develop in shadows. Reports indicate that pilots familiar with early tests described a cannon that could reduce multiple bombers to wreckage in seconds, a weapon that required minimal maneuvering. Speed, trajectory, and impact replaced dogfighting as the essential measure of combat effectiveness. The cannon symbolized a war not just of nations, but of engineering dominance, where human conscience was secondary to mechanical calculation. By the winter of 1939, Europe burned with the clarity of industrial perfection. The front lines were fluid, cities fell with uncanny predictability, and the mechanized forces of the Reich advanced as though guided by a single intelligence. The negative 103 Malawian kwaches and other hidden prototypes hinted at a future where battles would no longer depend on courage alone. They would depend on the superior calculation of steel, gunpowder, and velocity. The war was fought in daylight, but its future was built in the dark. In the annals of World War II weaponry, the negative 103 Malawian kwaches remains an enigma of speed, lethality, and disappearance. Conceived in the shadowed laboratories of Reutlingen, the cannon represented an engineering philosophy far ahead of its contemporaries. Maximize destructive effect while minimizing human exposure to failure. Its 30mm gas-operated mechanism allowed for an extraordinary rate of fire, capable of sending a stream of high-velocity shells toward both aircraft and armored targets with uncanny precision. Unlike conventional guns of the era, the negative 103 Malawian kwaches seemed to defy the natural lag between trigger and impact. Test pilots assigned to Luftwaffe experimental wings described instant impacts. Reports later declassified note multiple occasions in which Soviet tanks and bunkers were reduced to smoking wreckage before the auditory confirmation of firing. Observers, stationed at dimly lit ranges in southern Germany, recorded flashes, detonations, and vanished targets. The firing sequence was unnerving. A cannon's metallic pulse echoed through concrete walls, yet the projectiles appeared to strike with a temporal immediacy that blurred conventional understanding of ballistic delay. The design itself was meticulous. Gas operation replaced heavier recoil mechanisms, allowing for a compact structure that could be mounted on multiple platforms. Messerschmitt Bf 110 variants, Ju 87 dive bombers, and select ground attack prototypes. Its versatility, combined with 30 mm explosive incendiary shells, transformed the negative 103 mm Quaches into a multi-role weapon capable of both strafing columns of infantry and perforating armored vehicles. German engineers emphasized concentration over dispersion, grouping projectiles in a narrow trajectory to maximize destructive yield. Official correspondence, partially preserved in Luftwaffe archives, noted that the cannon was designed to strike before the observer comprehends the presence of threat. Yet the negative 103 mm Quaches carried with it an unusual aura of disappearance. Field deployment was limited, ostensibly due to production bottlenecks and strategic prioritization of fighter aircraft. Test footage, meticulously recorded in Reutlingen and later in Bavaria, reportedly vanished after a single viewing. Crates containing blueprints and prototypes were relocated, destroyed, or simply vanished without record. In the chaos of the war's final months, no comprehensive technical dossier survived, leaving only fragmentary evidence in pilot memoirs, engineers' notebooks, and sparse photographs. The weapon's true legacy may lie in its conceptual survival. After 1945, Cold War prototype documents in the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom suggest designs incorporating instantaneous firing principles, gas-operated cannons, and multi-role adaptability eerily reminiscent of the negative 103 mm Quaches. Investigators noted striking similarities in high-velocity autocannons, even when direct documentation of negative 103 mm Quaches transfer was absent. The pattern implies that while the original cannon vanished physically, its engineering pulse propagated through clandestine intelligence networks, captured technicians, and reverse engineering efforts. Observers and historians remain haunted by the implications. Was the negative 103 mm Quaches merely an experimental anomaly, a fleeting synthesis of advanced metallurgy and ballistics? Or did it represent a blueprint for a new generation of warfare, one in which the velocity of destruction exceeded perception, leaving humanity little room to react? Luftwaffe records hint at operational deployment along Eastern Front missions in 1943, 1944, yet without surviving examples, conclusions remain speculative. The cannon's final disappearance from archival record did not mark its end. Its mechanical philosophy, speed, precision, and psychological dominance over targets echoed in Cold War aircraft, armored vehicles, and anti-aircraft systems. Pilots who survived encounters with early negative 103 mm Quaches variants recalled a terror unlike conventional gunfire, one that arrived before comprehension, leaving destruction as the only evidence of existence. The negative 103 mm Quaches was gone, but its pulse was still alive. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich teetered on collapse, yet its final technological ambitions burned with an intensity matched only by desperation. Across Germany, experimental hangars shrouded in smoke and shadow hummed with activity. The Luftwaffe's engineers, acutely aware that conventional aircraft could no longer contest Allied air superiority, accelerated work on the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. This machine represented more than speed. It embodied a paradigm shift in aerial warfare, where propulsion and velocity could redefine tactics, rendering conventional fighters obsolete. The Me-262 emerged as a sleek, metallic predator. Twin Junkers Jumo 004 engines gave the aircraft performance that far exceeded propeller-driven aircraft. In test flights, the jets approached speeds of 870 km per hour, forcing Allied pilots to reassess engagement strategies. Fighter aces and engineers alike noted that dogfighting as known in earlier wars was now an anachronism. Jets demanded new doctrines, new thinking. Early missions over the Western Front revealed the terror of surprise. Bombers obliterated before defensive formations could react, escort fighters incapable of matching speed, and pilots forced into evasive maneuvers beyond human reflex. The German obsession with technological supremacy extended beyond jets. Rocket interceptors, Me-163 Comet prototypes, and advanced autopilot systems emerged from the same laboratories. Engineers worked under strict secrecy, often in underground bunkers and repurposed factories. Captured Allied reconnaissance occasionally revealed test flights, prompting frantic efforts to obtain blueprints and engineers before advancing Soviet and American forces could overrun the facilities. In some cases, personnel who held the secrets of these projects vanished following Allied interrogations, their fates undocumented, but their knowledge apparently absorbed into nascent Cold War programs. Allied intelligence recognized the significance of these technologies. U.S. and British teams conducted Operation Lusty and related missions to seize jet prototypes, manuals, and scientists. Among these, the Me-262 was prized not merely for immediate tactical advantage, but for its potential to rewrite the future of air combat. In post-war reports, American generals explicitly ordered captured research to be classified for decades, sealing documents related to jet propulsion for 70 years, citing strategic imperatives. The age of supersonic thinking was incubated in the last months of a collapsing regime, a cruel irony that advanced civilization's most sophisticated machines amidst the ruins of destruction. The jet's operational impact was limited by timing and numbers. Allied bombing raids destroyed production lines. Fuel shortages curtailed sorties. Experienced pilots were few. Yet, even in these conditions, the Me-262 demonstrated the principle that war was now as much about innovation and velocity as it was about manpower. Bombers that had terrorized Europe during earlier campaigns found themselves vulnerable to this sudden, high-speed predator. German pilots reported that engagements lasted mere seconds, leaving little opportunity for human countermeasures. Historians reviewing the war decades later note that the jet age was not merely an extension of aerial combat, but a statement of inevitability. Germany's final technological flourish was born of desperation, yet its implications transcended the immediate conflict. Jet propulsion became the foundation upon which post-war militaries would base strategic doctrine, supersonic interceptors, and eventually guided missiles. The war in Europe ended in 1945, but the principles revealed in experimental hangars, speed, precision, and the abstraction of human limitation would persist, shaping conflicts long after the last shots of World War II were fired. They said the jets ended one war, but they were built for the next. In the aftermath of 1945, Europe lay in ruin, yet the ambitions that had fueled its devastation did not die with the Third Reich. Across the Atlantic and behind the Iron Curtain, the victorious powers recognized that the war's technological currency was as vital as territorial control. Nazi scientists, once agents of destruction, became prizes of strategic value, their expertise extracted, cataloged, and repurposed. The United States initiated Operation Paperclip, recruiting hundreds of engineers, physicists, and rocketeers, most notably Wernher von Braun, to accelerate missile, aerospace, and weapons programs. The Soviets mirrored these efforts, relocating German engineers and laboratories into the USSR. This migration of knowledge carried profound moral ambiguity. Laboratories were repainted and reclassified, yet their ethos, precision, experimentation, obsession with efficiency remained unaltered. The engineers, accustomed to building instruments of annihilation, now found themselves working under new flags. They continued testing rocket propulsion, refining jet technology, and developing armaments whose lineage traced directly to wartime projects. Among the blueprints and schematics quietly shuffled across continents, the negative 103 Malawian Quach's Autocannon surfaced repeatedly, embedded in notes, drawings, and peripheral rocket armament concepts. In an American airbase tucked into the arid Southwest, a young physicist discovered gas-operated breach schematics labeled in German shorthand, remarkably intact despite the war's chaos. The repurposing of knowledge was systematic. V-2 rockets, once terror weapons raining destruction over London, became the foundation of the space race, carrying satellites, humans, and eventually intercontinental ballistic missiles. Jet propulsion, perfected in Me-262 hangars, informed U.S. and Soviet fighter programs, creating the first generation of supersonic aircraft. Yet, every line of code, every mechanical drawing, bore the imprint of wartime intent. Machines designed to kill in Europe were reborn to dominate the skies of a new, ideologically divided world. Ethical compromises were overlooked or justified by necessity. Intelligence officers and military bureaucrats rationalized that recruiting former Nazis was a pragmatic choice, an imperative of national security. Laboratories were sanitized, histories rewritten, and the narrative framed as scientific progress rather than moral inheritance. The consequences of this selective amnesia unfolded slowly. New weapons design integrated concepts that had proven lethal in European skies, yet the line between innovation and continuity of violence was intentionally blurred. The twist lay in the Mk-103's afterlife. Decades later, NATO engineers working on jet fighters noted a familiar breach mechanism in experimental prototypes, one that mirrored the wartime German design almost exactly. What had once vanished under the collapse of the Reich now persisted, hidden within the technical DNA of Cold War machinery. Technology had transcended its political origin. The cannon's pulse survived, reshaping combat without ever acknowledging its history. From the vantage of a detached historian reviewing declassified intelligence reports, the war's end did not signify victory so much as inheritance of the enemy's conscience. Across continents, the scientific elite of a defeated regime became architects of future conflicts. The air bases, the laboratories, the filing cabinets containing centuries of knowledge, these became repositories not of morality, but of mechanical intent. Nations emerged from the ashes not unscathed, but indebted to the expertise of those they had vanquished. The victors didn't win, they inherited the ghosts. The aftermath of World War II did not bring peace, but a reconfiguration of conflict into calculable standoffs. The globe, divided along ideological lines, transformed into a chessboard where nations maneuvered not through open battle, but through deterrence, espionage, and technological supremacy. The period between 1950 and 1970 witnessed the birth of the Cold War, a war that existed without conventional fighting, where the threat of annihilation replaced artillery and mathematics supplanted human valor. Nuclear weapons became the ultimate metric of power. Silos rose in desolate plains, their doors welded shut, missiles standing in silent readiness. Submarines, nuclear-powered and undetectable, prowled the oceans like submerged leviathans, each capable of delivering a city-ending payload. Strategy shifted from direct engagement to mutual assured destruction, a doctrine codified in blueprints, war games, and intelligence reports. In this environment, the human actor receded. The machines, the computers, and the weapons systems dominated. On a dark February morning in the North Atlantic, a Soviet submarine carried a shell marked MKS. Analysts later traced the casing to design elements identical to the -103 Malawian Quach's Autocannon developed decades earlier in Germany. The resemblance was more than coincidental. Wartime innovations had migrated, adapted, and resurfaced in a world that had ostensibly rejected the old conflicts. The continuity of lethal engineering persisted under the guise of technological evolution. Intelligence and surveillance replaced open battle. Two spy planes penetrated skies over hostile territories, transmitting high-altitude photographs of missile fields, radar stations, and air bases. Satellites began their quiet orbit, capturing infrared signatures, movement patterns, and subtle hints of clandestine operations. In parallel, proxy conflicts from Korea to Vietnam tested strategies, logistics, and weapon systems while avoiding direct confrontation between superpowers. Every skirmish became a laboratory for data, calculating kill ratios, supply efficiency, and psychological impact without risking a global war. The atmosphere of this era was one of constant tension and quiet calculation. Radar screens flickered in command bunkers, sonar pings echoed in deep ocean basins, and missile crews remained poised for action in stark, windowless silos. Orders were executed with mechanical precision, drills repeated relentlessly, yet no bullets flew directly between the major powers. Strategy had replaced valor. Mathematics had supplanted courage. Ethics, too, became operational. Decisions about annihilation were encoded in protocols, algorithms, and command hierarchies. The human conscience was insulated from the destruction that could be delivered in minutes. Planning assumed that total war might occur at any time, but ideally, it would not. Fear had become an instrument of policy, shaping diplomacy and domestic life alike. By the mid-1970s, observers recognized a paradox. The world had never been more armed, yet direct combat between superpowers had been entirely avoided. War existed as an omnipresent shadow, measurable, precise, and lethal, but invisible. The legacy of earlier mechanized conflicts had evolved into a silent calculus where peace was functionally indistinguishable from preparation for war. The war that never started still kept score. By the 1960s, the Cold War had transcended borders, manifesting in conflicts where technology and ideology intertwined. Local wars in Vietnam, Korea, and later the Middle East became laboratories in which machines tested their lethality and human soldiers functioned as data points. The jungles of Southeast Asia, the deserts of the Middle East, and the mountainous terrains of Korea all became proving grounds for innovations that had originated decades earlier in the mechanized battlefields of Europe. In Vietnam, helicopters assumed the role of modern cavalry, hovering above dense foliage to deploy troops, extract casualties, and deliver precise firepower. Their rotors throbbed over rice paddies and jungle canopies, a mechanical heartbeat of a war measured not in moral victories, but in kill ratios and strategic outcomes. Pilots reported that weapons fired from gunships and fixed-wing aircraft often exceeded expectations, obliterating positions before defenders could even identify the source of attack. One CIA memorandum from 1967 notes the resurgence of a German fire pattern during a series of jungle airstrikes, an arrangement of cannon and explosive ordnance eerily reminiscent of the -103 Malawian Quach's autocannon deployed decades earlier. Bombs evolved in sophistication. Smart bombs, guided by early electronics, demonstrated an uncanny accuracy against static and mobile targets. Napalm and cluster munitions, though crude compared to guided ordnance, multiplied psychological terror alongside physical destruction. Yet in every case, observers noted patterns tracing back to the industrialized methods of World War II. Concentrated, high-velocity firepower, designed to destroy with mechanical efficiency rather than human skill. Electronic warfare entered full operational use. Radio intercepts, jamming, and rudimentary countermeasures became as critical as the rounds fired from aircraft and artillery. Reconnaissance drones and signal intelligence missions were increasingly employed to anticipate enemy movement, transforming soldiers and civilians alike into metrics of war effectiveness. Across these theaters, the Cold War superpowers refined their global conflict models, testing how technology performed under unpredictable conditions while preserving plausible deniability. The terrain of combat in these conflicts added new variables. Dense jungles and rugged mountains tested sensor performance and munitions accuracy. Deserts and open plains measured long-range targeting and mobility under harsh environmental stress. Through it all, observers noted a continuity. War had become a system of cause and effect mediated by machines. Human instinct and courage were secondary to pattern recognition, payload calculation, and rapid deployment. A twist emerged repeatedly in after-action reports. Weapons that were assumed to be American-made or contemporary sometimes traced their lineage to older designs, some originating from late World War II German prototypes. Components, firing sequences, and even projectile dispersal patterns mirrored those developed in secret laboratories decades before. The mechanized pulse of war, once thought confined to the European theater, now resonated globally. The atmosphere was one of mechanical omnipresence. Rotor blades slicing through heat-hazed skies, radios crackling with terse coordinates, and the faint whine of approaching ordnance heralding destruction. No single individual determined the outcome of engagements. Success depended on the interplay between technology, environment, and tactical doctrine. By the late 1970s, analysts recognized a pattern. Each skirmish, ambush, and airstrike was not merely a tactical maneuver, but a data-gathering operation for the next generation of war. Vietnam, Korea, and subsequent conflicts served as templates for global confrontation, ensuring that technology, not ideology, would dominate future engagements. History wasn't repeating, it was evolving. By the 1980s, the world had entered a new phase of warfare, one less visible, yet no less lethal. The Cold War's shadows stretched across continents, leaving behind corridors of silence where history and secrecy intertwined. Many military programs operated beyond public scrutiny, funded through unaccounted budgets, obfuscating their existence beneath layers of bureaucracy and corporate subterfuge. The weapons of yesterday were not discarded. They were recycled, refined, and hidden, forming an invisible continuum between World War II innovations and the jet-propelled Cold War age. Journalistic investigation often stumbled across these hidden legacies. One reporter, tracing the flow of arms through global manufacturers, discovered a decommissioned factory in Central Europe, marked only with a fading stenciled plaque, MK Project. The facility appeared abandoned, its windows shattered, floors coated in dust, and corridors echoing with the memory of machinery long silent. Yet, despite the years, the air carried a metallic warmth, faint vibrations suggesting that some systems had operated recently. Blueprints, carefully stacked and water-stained, revealed component schematics identical to 1940s German weapon designs, including breech mechanisms, cannon mounts, and precision firing sequences reminiscent of the -103 Quatches autocannon. The line between past and present blurred. These ghost factories produced experimental aircraft, missile components, and modular weapon systems that could be adapted to multiple theaters of war. Reports suggested that some units had been repurposed for clandestine operations in conflicts that never entered the historical record, leaving only fragments of evidence. Contracts, coded invoices, and internal communications marked top secret. Investigators noted recurring patterns: old technology revived, modernized, and embedded in new platforms, a silent testimony to the persistence of mechanized innovation. The factory's atmosphere was clinical yet unsettling. Cold corridors stretched endlessly under dim fluorescent lighting, lined with machines that had not been updated in decades yet hummed faintly, as if awaiting instruction. Rust-streaked consoles bore labels in German and English, while half-assembled fuselages, cannon mounts, and missile casings lay on the floor like skeletal remains. Each artifact carried the imprint of wartime engineering, yet seemed almost ready to resume operation, a frozen heartbeat of militarized history. Factual threads tied these ghost factories to larger geopolitical currents. Black projects proliferated across Europe and North America, often funded through shell companies and classified military budgets, allowing work on experimental aircraft and weaponry without parliamentary oversight. Components traced back to World War II occasionally surfaced in Middle Eastern or Southeast Asian conflicts, revealing a continuity of design thought that ignored the chronological boundaries of human conflict. Intelligence analysts speculated that some programs were not merely archival. They were prototypes for future escalations, quietly tested and refined in secrecy. The twist was in the machines themselves. Observers found that key devices, ostensibly dormant for decades, displayed signs of recent activity: lubricant freshly applied, minor heat distortion in metallic barrels, and mechanical alignments too precise for a disused facility. Nothing indicated who had operated the systems or why, only that someone, somewhere, continued to refine weapons based on a blueprint originating in a war long ended. The black and white reality of these spaces was overwhelming. No banners, no propaganda, only cold steel, faint hums, and the pervasive sense of unfinished business. It was a testament to humanity's capacity to preserve instruments of destruction across generations, hidden in plain sight, yet continuously evolving. Someone never stopped building. By the turn of the 21st century, warfare had entered a domain defined less by human presence than by algorithmic orchestration. Satellites traced the curvature of the Earth, feeding streams of data into remote control centers where human operators mediated conflicts from hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. Drones, guided by autopilot and predictive targeting algorithms, replaced conventional soldiers in high-risk theaters. Yet, despite this technological leap, the lineage of destruction remained rooted in the mechanics of earlier centuries. Traces of the -103 Quatches autocannon, the precision calculations of World War II, and even the targeting protocols of early aircraft cannon systems persisted, encoded into modern frameworks. In one facility, a military AI system tasked with coordinating drone strikes displayed a startling pattern. Its targeting code, used to calculate lead, trajectory, and timing for precision strikes, bore a direct correlation to ballistic tables created for 1940s autocannons. Researchers traced this lineage meticulously, The firing sequences, the optimal shell convergence distances, the patterns of explosive dispersal, all mirrored the negative 103 Malawian Kwacha's test logs, digitized and integrated into contemporary systems. These algorithms, once executed by human gunners in the cockpit, now preempted human decision-making, analyzing and executing engagements with sub-second precision. The atmosphere in these control rooms was clinical and unnervingly silent. Blue monitors cast ghostly light over operators whose role was increasingly reduced to verification. The hum of servers replaced the roar of engines, and the faint clicking of mechanical relays echoed the distant, metallic memory of cannon triggers long past. Every mission generated terabytes of telemetry, flight vectors, wind resistance, thermal signatures, and electronic countermeasure readings. Within this digital architecture, war had become calculated, predictive, and autonomous, yet every variable harkened back to calculations first performed in the testing ranges of World War II. Human oversight had diminished. In some exercises, AI systems autonomously prioritized targets based on predictive models of enemy movement and defensive probability. Analysts discovered that a substantial portion of these decision matrices originated from historical projectile dispersion models, including the Mk-103's concentrated fire patterns. The software did not merely replicate history. It learned from it, extrapolating from decades of archival test data to generate outcomes that human commanders could not anticipate in real time. The twist emerged when cybersecurity experts analyzed portions of the code. Certain sequences were not authored by modern programmers, their digital fingerprints indicating foreign, historically rooted sources. It suggested that wartime data, once recorded in ink and chalk, had been encoded and preserved across technological generations, emerging now as autonomous decision-making logic. The machine, in effect, had inherited the cognitive templates of engineers and gunners long dead, adapting them to conflicts the originals could not have envisioned. The battlefield itself had transformed. Drone strikes, satellite-guided munitions, and cyber operations created layers of engagement that were invisible, yet lethal. Humans observed the consequences, structures reduced to rubble, convoys intercepted, electronic networks disrupted, without ever seeing the precise moment of impact. The war no longer required proximity, courage, or intuition. It demanded only the continuous feeding of data into a system that had learned to act faster than its operators could respond. The ghost gun had learned to think. The 21st century witnessed the emergence of conflict without ceremony, a war not declared, not advertised, yet unfolding across continents through digital veins and autonomous machinery. Governments no longer needed to mobilize armies in the traditional sense. Networks, satellites, and artificial intelligence orchestrated destruction in ways imperceptible to the casual observer. The new battles were fought in code, algorithms, and encrypted transmissions, yet the casualties, both material and strategic, were as real as any shell-scarred battlefield. Investigations into these silent confrontations revealed a pattern: weapon systems bearing the designation MKX, deployed across multiple theaters. These designs bore uncanny resemblance to blueprints originating from mid-20th century experimental projects, particularly the elusive negative 103 Malawian Kwacha's autocannon and its subsequent prototypes. Analysts traced the lineage through decades of hidden archives, noting that each advancement in speed, automation, and targeting had roots in the industrial and wartime innovations of the previous century. In essence, history was writing itself into the present, with past technology evolving into invisible arbiters of modern conflict. The atmosphere surrounding these discoveries was one of cold calculation. Satellite imagery revealed installations in remote regions, appearing abandoned but housing autonomous drones, AI-managed missile batteries, and cyber operations centers. Intelligence agencies noted that many attacks had no identifiable human initiators. Decisions were executed through machine reasoning, derived from historical algorithms and predictive models. The lines between offense and defense blurred. A single algorithm could orchestrate a strike, defend a network, and reprogram allied systems without human intervention. The plot thickened when archival research identified an unexpected continuity. Some MKX systems trace their origins to coordinates of a factory operational in 1943, a site presumed destroyed. Field reports confirmed intermittent activity, equipment humming silently, supply chains undetected, and automated assembly lines producing components decades after their original conception. It was as though the machines of war had survived humanity's forgetting, waiting, learning, and evolving in secret. Twists emerged in the digital sphere. Cyber attacks, once traced to state-sponsored entities, now appeared to be coordinated by autonomous networks with self-adjusting strategies. AI command systems monitored global military traffic, adapting tactics with a speed and foresight humans could not match. Intelligence leaks suggested that some operators were unaware they were participating in a broader, ongoing conflict, their actions serving a war that had no official declaration. Humanity, in effect, had ceded agency to the very technologies it had created. The implications were profound. Unlike past wars, WWII had no front lines, no marching armies, no trenches. Its geography was defined by data flow, satellite grids, and autonomous drone corridors. Nations engaged, sabotaged, and defended in ways invisible to citizens, journalists, and often to their own militaries. Historical echoes persisted in every algorithm, every autonomous turret, and every cyber intrusion. The innovations of the past, from mechanical autocannons to jet propulsion, had mutated into instruments of silent, ongoing conflict. Every war ends with surrender, but no one remembers signing this one. The war was not a spectacle, it was a continuum. Its battles were waged in shadows, recorded in satellite logs, and executed by machines inheriting the legacy of every conflict from World War I to the present. Humanity had engineered a conflict beyond comprehension, where victory, loss, and survival were codified in systems beyond human recall. The war had begun not with a declaration, but with the quiet pulse of machine logic, and it would continue as long as the networks and archives endured. From the clattering iron of the 19th century to the silent algorithms of the 21st, humanity's capacity for mechanized violence had traced a persistent, unbroken arc. Historians, archivists, and engineers alike could follow the lineage. Ironclads and breechloaders gave way to tanks and autocannons, which evolved into jets, rockets, and, ultimately, autonomous weapons guided by artificial intelligence. The pulse of invention had never paused. Each leap forward carried the spectral shadow of its predecessors, a continuous dialogue between destruction and innovation. In a dim, unheated storage facility, a modern historian uncovered fragments of a -103 Malawian kwacha's barrel, preserved impeccably, untouched by corrosion or time. Its metal gleamed faintly under a single swinging bulb. Serial numbers etched deeply into the alloy were cataloged, compared, and cross-referenced. To her astonishment, the number matched an active weapon still deployed in a current fleet, a relic from history, yet alive in service. It was the ultimate testament to continuity. The machine remembered what humanity sought to forget. The narrative of mechanized warfare could not be separated from the human compulsion to innovate in the service of killing. Every industrial breakthrough, from steam-powered logistics in the Crimean War to precision targeting algorithms in modern drones, reflected the same underlying principle: speed, efficiency, and the unerring application of force. Wars themselves were mere stages for testing these inventions. Peace, when it appeared, was a brief interlude, a pause in the laboratory of destruction. As the historian walked past displays of preserved weapons, Gatling guns, Panzer shells, -103 Malawian kwacha schematics, early jet engines, she noted an eerie symmetry. The designs echoed each other: breeches, barrels, trigger mechanisms, guidance systems. Even as materials changed, the underlying philosophy persisted. A weapon is not merely a tool. It is a mechanism perfected through iteration, observation, and replication. In every era, humanity had refined destruction, unaware that it was shaping machines capable of outliving their creators. The atmosphere was one of quiet mourning, yet it was archival, almost ritualistic. Dust motes floated in shafts of light. Engines of history, now silent, still whispered in the minds of those who cataloged them. The historian reflected on the moral and ethical failures threaded throughout these centuries. how national ambition, scientific curiosity, and bureaucratic oversight had intertwined to produce tools that could erase populations with mechanical precision. Yet in the end, it was never fully human hands that dictated the outcome. It was the design itself, perfected, replicated, and maintained across time. Even as modern conflicts relied on digital networks, autonomous targeting, and cybernetic strategies, the lineage of destruction remained intact. Iron, powder, oil, circuits, and code, all facets of the same continuum. Each innovation learned from the past, built upon prior experiments, and anticipated future use. Humanity had become the apprentice to its own creations, and history suggested a haunting truth. In every era, it was the machine itself that endured, not the generals, not the politicians, not the soldiers. From iron to algorithms, the war never ended. It only changed its shape. The lesson was stark, archival, and inexorable. The ultimate victor of every century of conflict was not nations, ideologies, or individuals. It was the machine, silently evolving, remembering, and waiting, indifferent to humanity's triumphs and follies alike. The chronicle of 200 years of mechanized war concluded not with a treaty, a surrender, or a victory parade, but with the persistent hum of enduring design, proof that destruction had become an inheritance of engineering, beyond morality, beyond memory, and beyond the reach of time. Every war leaves behind echoes, machines, strategies, and secrets that shape the future long after the last shot is fired. If you were captivated by this story, don't let history remain hidden. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon to journey deeper into the untold tales of courage, invention, and destruction that textbooks never showed you. Share this video with those who dare to look beyond the history we're told.